The morning sun climbed lazily over the horizon on December 7, 1941, casting a golden glow across the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida checked his instruments one final time as he led the first wave of Japanese aircraft toward the unsuspecting American naval base. Below him, sailors aboard the USS Arizona were raising the American flag, some still in their pajamas, others heading to breakfast, none aware of the approaching storm of fire and steel that would forever alter the course of history. Tora! 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 Fuchida's triumphant code crackled through the radio, signaling to the Japanese fleet that they had achieved complete surprise. Within moments, the peaceful Sunday morning erupted into chaos as bombs whistled through the air and torpedoes sliced through the harbor waters. Seaman First Class James Sullivan had just finished his morning coffee when the first explosion shook the deck beneath his feet. Racing to his battle station aboard the USS West Virginia, he watched in horror as Japanese dive bombers screamed overhead, their rising sun insignias unmistakable against the clear blue sky. "This can't be happening," he whispered, as the mighty battleships of America's Pacific Fleet began to burn and list. The attack came in two precise waves, a masterpiece of military planning orchestrated by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Torpedo planes struck first, followed by high-level bombers, dive bombers, and fighters strafing the airfields to prevent American aircraft from mounting a defense. The harbor, once a symbol of American naval might in the Pacific, transformed into an apocalyptic tableau of burning oil, twisted metal, and desperate men diving into blackened waters. As reported by the New York Times on December 8, 1941. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. On the deck of the USS Oklahoma, Ensign William Johnson struggled to maintain his footing as the massive battleship began to roll. "Abandon ship!" came the desperate cry as the vessel capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her hull. Those who escaped jumped into water aflame with burning oil, swimming desperately toward shore while Japanese fighters strafed the surface. At Hickam Field, Private Robert Martinez watched helplessly as American aircraft, neatly parked in rows to prevent sabotage, became perfect targets for the Japanese attackers. The irony was bitter. What had been a defensive measure against espionage had created an opportunity for devastating air assault. In just under 2 hours, the attack claimed 2,403 American lives. 8 battleships were damaged, with 5 sunk. The USS Arizona, struck by a modified 16-inch naval shell that penetrated her forward ammunition magazine, erupted in a cataclysmic explosion that killed 1,177 of her crew in an instant. As the Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers, Lieutenant Commander Fuchida surveyed the devastation below with a mixture of professional pride and quiet foreboding. They had achieved their military objective with stunning efficiency, but as he later wrote in his memoirs, "I had a strange feeling in my heart that we had awakened a sleeping giant." In Washington, D.C., President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received the news with grim resolve. The following day, standing before Congress, he delivered a speech that would galvanize a nation and launch America into World War II. The sleeping giant was indeed awake, and its fury would soon be felt across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the deck of a patrol boat, surveying the wreckage of Pearl Harbor just 3 weeks after the attack. Sunken ships jutted from the harbor waters like the gravestones of giants. Yet amid the destruction, he noted with strategic acumen what the Japanese had failed to target: the naval repair facilities, oil storage tanks, and crucially, the aircraft carriers that had been at sea during the attack. "They have awakened us, but they have left us the means to fight back," he remarked to his aide. Nimitz, newly appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, would prove to be the architect of America's naval resurgence. Throughout the early months of 1942, the situation in the Pacific appeared dire. The Japanese Empire expanded with frightening speed, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. General Douglas MacArthur, forced to evacuate from the Philippines, made his famous promise: I shall return. But how such a return could be accomplished seemed beyond imagination, as Imperial Japan established its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere with brutal efficiency. According to accounts published in Life magazine in June 1942, the Japanese advance seemed unstoppable, their naval and air forces projecting power across distances that military strategists had previously thought impossible to sustain. Yet beneath the surface of these Japanese victories, American industrial might was awakening. Factories across the United States converted to war production with astonishing speed. Shipyards operated around the clock, launching new vessels at a pace that would soon overwhelm Japan's capacity to replace its losses. While the empire could conquer territory, it could not match America's industrial output, a fact that Admiral Yamamoto understood all too well. In a small room at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers worked tirelessly to crack the Japanese naval codes. Their work, conducted in stifling heat to simulate Pacific conditions, would prove decisive in the coming months. Through their efforts, American intelligence began to unravel Japanese intentions, providing Nimitz with the precious gift of foreknowledge. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander James Doolittle planned a mission so audacious it bordered on the impossible, a carrier-launched bombing raid against Tokyo itself. While of limited military value, the psychological impact would be immense. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers took off from the deck of the USS Hornet, a feat previously thought impossible for such large aircraft. When news of the Doolittle raid reached Emperor Hirohito's palace, the shock was profound. The divine wind that had historically protected Japan from invasion had failed. American bombs had fallen on the sacred homeland. The psychological impact far outweighed the physical damage, shattering the myth of Japan's invulnerability. In the wake of this raid, Admiral Yamamoto accelerated his plans to eliminate America's aircraft carriers once and for all. He set his sights on Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategic American outpost northwest of Hawaii. The stage was set for a confrontation that would alter the balance of power in the Pacific forever. As spring turned to early summer in 1942, both nations prepared for a battle that neither fully understood would become the turning point of the Pacific War. The vengeance for Pearl Harbor was about to be unleashed, not as a single strike, but as the beginning of a long, remorseless campaign that would ultimately bring the Empire of Japan to its knees. Dawn broke over the Central Pacific on June 4, 1942, revealing a vast emptiness of rolling waves and scattered clouds. Yet hidden within this apparent void, two great naval forces converged: the Imperial Japanese Navy under Admiral Yamamoto, confident after 6 months of unbroken victories, and the smaller American fleet commanded by Admiral Nimitz, gambling everything on the intelligence provided by his codebreakers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered anxiously from the cockpit of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. He and his squadron from the USS Enterprise had been searching for the Japanese carriers, but their intelligence on the enemy's position had been imprecise. With fuel gauges approaching the critical mark, McCluskey faced a decision that would alter history: turn back or press on. Noticing a suspicious wake in the ocean below, he banked his aircraft and followed. There they are. The call electrified the American pilots as they spotted the Japanese carrier fleet below, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, their decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed for a strike against the American carriers. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability for the pride of the Japanese Navy. The Naval Institute proceedings later described this moment. Never in the history of naval warfare had so much pivoted on a single tactical decision: McCluskey's choice. To follow that wake changed the course of the Pacific War in 5 devastating minutes. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had just ordered a change in armament for his aircraft, from torpedoes designed to sink ships to bombs intended for the Midway airfield. The decks of his carriers were in chaos, littered with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines, when the first American dive bombers appeared overhead. The Americans struck with devastating precision. Dive bombers plummeted nearly vertically, releasing their payload only when they were sure of a hit. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into infernos. The carefully arranged aircraft on their decks became additional fuel for the conflagration, their bombs and torpedoes detonating in sympathetic explosions that tore through the vessels. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the same commander who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, watched from the Akagi's bridge as his ship died around him. "It was as if the gods themselves had turned against us," he later wrote. "In those few minutes, we lost everything. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, survived long enough to launch a counterattack that severely damaged the USS Yorktown. But by day's end, American aircraft found and destroyed the Hiryu as well. In less than 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots, men who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. Lieutenant Richard Best, who delivered the killing blow to the Akagi, with a single perfectly placed bomb, returned to the Enterprise with barely enough fuel to land. As he stepped from his aircraft, exhausted but triumphant, he understood they had achieved something momentous, though the full strategic implications would only become clear with time. In his command center at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz received the news with quiet satisfaction. "Pearl Harbor has been avenged," he remarked simply to his staff. But this was more than revenge. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan had lost the initiative and would remain on the defensive for the remainder of the war. The Battle of Midway represented America's first major naval victory of the war, and perhaps its most consequential. In the years to come, as new American carriers rolled from shipyards while Japan struggled to replace its losses, naval historians would recognize Midway as the point where the tide irrevocably turned. The sleeping giant was now fully awake, and its industrial might was beginning to make itself felt across the vast Pacific theater. By the summer of 1943, America's industrial output had transformed the war in the Pacific. New Essex-class aircraft carriers joined the fleet at the rate of 1 per month. Liberty ships carried endless streams of men and material across the vast ocean. The balance of power had shifted decisively, but translating this advantage into victory required a strategy that could overcome the vast distances and heavily fortified Japanese island garrisons. Marine Sergeant John Basilone crouched in the humid darkness of a transport ship, listening to the pre-dawn bombardment of Guadalcanal. The cacophony of naval gunfire preceded what would become America's first major land offensive in the Pacific War. As dawn broke on August 7, 1942, Basilone and thousands of other Marines stormed ashore, beginning a brutal, 6-month campaign that would establish the pattern for what lay ahead. "We're not going to try to fight our way through every Japanese stronghold," explained Admiral Ernest King to his commanders. "We're going to hop from island to island, selecting our targets to establish a chain of forward bases." This strategy, soon known as island hopping, would bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions, cutting them off and leaving them to wither on the vine, while the American advance continued toward Japan itself. As reported by war correspondent Ernie Pyle in the Washington Daily News, "This war in the Pacific is like no other in history. A 3-dimensional chess game played across thousands of miles of ocean, where control of tiny specks of land determines the fate of empires." The island-hopping campaign advanced along 2 main axes. In the South Pacific, General MacArthur pushed through New Guinea toward the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise to return. In the Central Pacific, Admiral Nimitz's forces seized the Gilbert Islands, then the Marshalls, then the Marianas, each victory bringing American bombers closer to the Japanese homeland. At Tarawa in November 1943, the Marines faced a horrific introduction to the fanatical Japanese defense. In 76 hours of fighting for an island smaller than Central Park, nearly 1,000 Americans died, and over 2,000 were wounded. The Japanese garrison of 4,500 defenders fought to the death. Only 17 surrendered. It was a pattern that would repeat across the Pacific, Japanese soldiers indoctrinated to believe that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, fighting with suicidal determination. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, watching his Marines recover from the Tarawa bloodbath, remarked grimly, "They told us it would be easy. Nothing in this war is going to be easy." Yet, despite the cost, the American advance continued with relentless momentum. By June 1944, American forces had reached the Mariana Islands. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam placed the Japanese home islands within range of the new B-29 superfortress bombers. Japan's military leaders understood the existential threat and committed the bulk of their remaining naval strength to a desperate gamble to stop the American advance. The resulting Battle of the untold Philippine Sea became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American fighters shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft. Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa lost 3 aircraft carriers and nearly 400 planes, effectively destroying Japan's naval air power. When aviators from the USS Lexington returned from pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet after sunset, the carrier's lights were daringly turned on to guide them home, a signal of how completely American naval dominance had been established. As 1944 drew to a close, the noose around Japan tightened. The destruction at Pearl Harbor, once a symbol of American vulnerability, had been transformed through industrial might and strategic genius into the engine of an unstoppable counteroffensive. The path of vengeance led inexorably toward the Japanese homeland, with each island conquest bringing American forces closer to a final reckoning. By early 1945, the strategic situation had become clear to all but the most fanatical Japanese leaders. American submarines had strangled Japan's maritime supply lines, cutting off oil, rubber, and other vital resources. B-29 bombers from the Marianas conducted regular raids on Japanese cities. Yet despite these disasters, Japan's military leadership remained committed to a strategy of bleeding America so severely in the final defense of the homeland that a negotiated peace might be obtained. This determination was on full display at Iwo Jima, where Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had transformed the small volcanic island into a fortress of interlocking tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions. When the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they stepped into what one survivor called a factory of death. Corporal Charles Lindbergh of the 28th Marines struggled up the loose volcanic ash of Mount Suribachi 5 days after the landing. Part of the patrol ordered to secure the summit, he helped raise a small American flag at the volcano's peak. Hours later, a larger flag replacement created the iconic moment captured by photographer Joe Rosenthal. 6 Marines raising the stars and stripes in an image that would become synonymous with American determination. Uncommon valor was a common virtue, Admiral Nimitz would later remark of the Marines at Iwo Jima. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, 21,900 died fighting. The American victory cost 6,821 Marines killed or wounded, a price paid to secure airfields that would provide emergency landing strips for B-29 bombers and fighter escorts for the final assault on Japan. The Chicago Tribune correspondent Robert Cromie wrote from Iwo Jima, "This black island has been converted into a memorial to courage, American and Japanese alike, that will endure as long as men remember the capacity of human beings to endure the unendurable." The battle for Okinawa, beginning on April 1, 1945, proved even more catastrophic. Over 82 days, 14,000 American servicemen died, while Japan lost over 100,000 soldiers and perhaps another 100,000 Okinawan civilians. The ferocity of the fighting and the scale of the kamikaze attacks against the American fleet offered a terrifying preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might cost. In the skies over Japan, General Curtis LeMay had meanwhile transformed the air campaign into a systematic destruction of Japanese industrial capacity and urban centers. On the night of March 9, 1945, 300 B-29 bombers dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo, creating a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of the largely wooden city and killed perhaps 100,000 civilians. Similar raids followed against other Japanese cities. Aboard the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, Captain Charles McVeigh received sealed orders in late July 1945. His ship was to deliver a mysterious cargo to Tinian Island in the Marianas. The cargo, components for the first atomic bombs, represented the culmination of the Manhattan Project, America's $3 billion gamble to create a weapon so terrible it might end the war without an invasion. On August 6th, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, destroying the city and killing approximately 80,000 people instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb devastated Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito broadcast his decision to surrender, citing a new and most cruel bomb that had made continued resistance futile. The announcement stunned Japanese soldiers and civilians alike. Many had been prepared to fight to the death with sharpened bamboo spears if necessary. Instead, they now faced the unfamiliar prospect of surrender and occupation. The empire that had struck so boldly at Pearl Harbor was now prostrate before the military might it had underestimated so catastrophically. On the morning of September 2, 1945, the gleaming decks of the USS Missouri hosted one of history's most significant ceremonies. In Tokyo Bay, surrounded by hundreds of Allied warships and aircraft, representatives of the Empire of Japan signed the instruments of surrender. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the 23-minute ceremony that formally ended World War II. It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, MacArthur declared. As he spoke, the American flag that had flown over the U.S. Capitol on December 7, 1941, hung above the proceedings, a symbolic journey from attack to victory. Captain Joseph Rochefort, whose code-breaking efforts had been crucial to the victory at Midway, watched the ceremony with mixed emotions. The intelligence war had been fought in the shadows, its victories largely unheralded but decisive. "Without intelligence," he later remarked quietly to a colleague, "this war might have lasted years longer." The occupation of Japan began under MacArthur's direction as Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. Many Americans expected harsh retribution against a former enemy whose brutality and war had shocked the world. Instead, MacArthur implemented a remarkably enlightened policy aimed at transforming Japan into a democratic ally, rather than punishing it as a defeated foe. The Christian Science Monitor observed in October 1945, "The most profound revolution in Japanese history is occurring not through violence, but through the deliberate reshaping of institutions under American guidance." Emperor Hirohito remained on the throne, but renounced his divinity. A new constitution established democratic governance, enshrined civil liberties, and, at American insistence, included Article 9, renouncing war as a sovereign right. Land reform, women's suffrage, and educational overhaul followed, fundamentally restructuring Japanese society. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki, the only survivor of the Japanese midget submarine attack on Pearl Harbor and America's first prisoner of war, returned to a transformed Japan in 1946. Initially ashamed of his surrender, he eventually became an advocate for peace and Japanese-American friendship, embodying the remarkable reconciliation between former enemies. The strategic importance of this reconciliation became apparent as the Cold War emerged. By 1951, as the United States found itself engaged in the Korean conflict, Japan signed a security treaty making it America's principal Asian ally against communism. The former enemy had become an essential partner in maintaining Pacific security. Pearl Harbor survivor Richard Fisk, who had witnessed the destruction of the USS West Virginia, began meeting annually with Zenji Abe, a Japanese pilot who had participated in the attack. Their friendship, blossoming in the 1980s, symbolized the human capacity for forgiveness and reconciliation. "We were both doing our duty for our countries," Fisk explained. "Now our duty is to ensure such a war never happens again." Joy. The turn of the 21st century, the alliance between Japan and the United States had become one of the most stable and important in the world. Japanese investment flowed into American industries, while American military forces guaranteed Japanese security. The countries that had once engaged in the most destructive naval war in history now conducted joint naval exercises in the same waters. The USS Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor and the Peace Memorial in Hiroshima stand as complementary monuments to the catastrophic conflict, reminders of how a surprise attack led to unprecedented devastation and, ultimately, to an improbable friendship. From the flaming waters of Pearl Harbor to the nuclear devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Pacific War traced an arc of escalating violence that eventually gave way to one of history's most successful reconciliations. The sleeping giant, awakened by the attack on December 7, 1941, had not only achieved victory, but had also found the wisdom to forge peace from the ashes of total war.